let's go ahead and get our fictional user interface back up here. And we're going to be talking about contrast this time. All right, so contrast helps separate elements from each other by adjusting color, the brightness, or kind of it's sometimes referred to as the value, things being bright or dark or light, and or opacity. So we can see here, we can change this title and we can affect the opacity, or the contrast rather, by changing the opacity. Now we can see, compared to the previous version, we can see this so much more. It has much more contrast than, say, this, for instance. Also, we can change the color here. This has a lot less contrast, for instance, compared to the original. And we can also change the value, or the lightness or darkness, which also affects the contrast. So when it comes to the contrast, it should be applied based on two factors, and each factor has a couple considerations. Is it type? And if so, is it text that they need to read? Now that might be a strange question, but I'll clarify that in a couple slides. Now, if it's not type, is it an important visual element that they need in order to use, or to effectively be able to use, the user interface? That could be something like an icon, for instance. So if it's type, and the type-based contrast should be applied given the following. So how large is the type? Should the type be readable? And does it adhere to the WCAG contrast guidelines? Now, WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So just to expand on what that is exactly, we have 4 different criteria here, and they're split up into small text versus large text, and also AA versus AAA. So small text should have a 4.5:1 ratio. Now, small text for AAA should have a 7:1 ratio. So what does that mean? So a higher ratio on the number on the left side of the colon means it's going to be it's going to have a lot more contrast, essentially. And AAA means, this is going to be really important type-based elements or icons or any type of element that needs to be visible. So large text, in this context of a AA, should have a 3:1 ratio. Now, why should it be less than, say, small text at 4:5? Well, basically, what this means is that the larger something is, the easier you're going to be able to see it. And so the contrast doesn't necessarily have to be as higher as compared to with small text. So let me show you an example here. So does this pass? And what this means is we're taking a look at this type element right here that literally says, does this pass? And we can see it is black on this light gray. And so here is a screenshot of a color contrast checker called Stark. And you can use that you can get that plugin for Figma as well as Adobe XD. And we can see when we run this through, you can see the foreground is here, which is black, and the background color that it's sitting on right here is this light gray. The result here is a 15.17:1 color contrast ratio, which means it has basically the maximum contrast ratio that we could have based on the background it's sitting. So it passes all of these 4 different criteria. Now, if we take that does this pass text rather, and we change it to gray, we can see it doesn't pass any of them. And then in this case, we're going to change it to a color, this blue color here, and it passes, and it also fails depending on which you're looking at. As we can see, it fails up here for normal text size. For large text, it does pass, at least at the AA ratio of 3:1, because it is 4.08:1. So large text is defined as 14 points, which is typically around 18, almost 19 pixels, and bold, or larger, or 18 points, typically 24 pixels or larger. In this case, this text, according to Adobe Experience Design, at least, which I used to design this, was 41 pixels. So it definitely does pass this here for the AA, for the WCAG guidelines. Now, remember I mentioned, does it need to be readable if it's text? Well, in this case, this is a watermark. And a watermark is just an element that could be text in the background. It's just a sort of graphic and asset to a design that doesn't necessarily have to be read. It's not an integral part in order for the user interface to function properly. So in this case, it's okay that there's very little contrast between itself and the background. Now right here, this obviously is not typed, but it's important. It's an important element. These are icons that may need to be used by the user. So you should use that WCAG guidelines to make sure that it contrasts enough based on what is behind it. So in this case, this is not text. If we're looking at this background here, this container, this white container. So we have some creative leeway. We don't have to adhere to those guidelines. We could change it to this. So we went to this extreme contrast right here, white on this blue color here, all the way to very little contrast, but it still works based on the elements inside of it. So as you can see, there's a lot of different considerations. Most importantly though, you have to ask yourself, is the element that I'm looking at contrast, does it need to be red? Or maybe better suited in terms of that question, does it need to be easily identifiable to the user? If so, you want to adhere to those WCAG guidelines, and I'll show you some tools that we can use both in the browser and in your design software to make sure that you are adhering to those WCAG guidelines. And then of course, if you don't have to adhere to those guidelines, there's still some considerations that you should make in order to make your designs look good. And so we'll certainly have a lot of experience and practice with that.